I was 17 and reckless, the kind of teenager who thought I was invincible. I didn't have a driver's license, which in a small town meant relying on friends, walking, or, as a last resort, hitchhiking. I had my rules, of course. Only get into cars with women or men with kids. I thought these rules would keep me safe. That was until one frigid evening when I broke them. It was a bone-chilling night, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones, and I had stayed late at a friend's house. Walking home wasn't an option. I needed a ride. As I stood shivering by the side of the road, my thumb out, a car pulled up. The driver was a man alone. He was average-looking, nothing particularly alarming about him. "Need a lift?" he asked, a friendly smile on his face. I hesitated, running through the possible risks in my mind. He seemed harmless enough, and I figured I could defend myself if needed. So, breaking my own rule, I got in. The ride started off quietly. He didn't say much, which was fine by me. I just wanted to get home. As we drove, the road seemed more treacherous, slick with ice from a recent snowfall. At one intersection, as we were about to cross, I saw a car sliding towards us, out of control on the ice. Instinctively, I yelled, "Watch out!" He reacted instantly, slamming on the gas and speeding through the intersection, narrowly avoiding a collision. But then his demeanor changed entirely. "Don't you ever scream at me?" he burst out, his voice filled with a sudden and terrifying anger. I was stunned, frozen in fear. This wasn't just anger. It was something more, something unhinged. I wanted out of the car now. "Please, can you pull over? I can walk from here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't listen. Instead, he started mumbling to himself, something about how she'd never listened to him, and he wasn't going to listen to me. It was as if he was in his own world, and I was just an intruder. The fear I felt then was like nothing I'd ever experienced. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, of what I could use as a weapon if I needed to defend myself. But I was trapped, speeding down a dark road with a man I didn't know, and suddenly feared. Finally, mercifully, he pulled into a gas station. "I think I better let you out," he said, his voice calmer but still tinged with that unsettling edge. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I bolted out of the car and started towards the convenience store, not looking back. But then I heard his voice again. "Hey," he called out. I turned to see him leaning out the window holding something out to me. It was my hat. I hadn't even realized I'd left it behind. Wariness battled with the biting cold and my need for my hat. I approached him slowly, ready to run at the first sign of trouble. He handed me the hat, and our eyes met. There was a hint of something, regret maybe in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't respond, just grabbed my hat and turned to leave. But as I did, something fell out, a note and tucked inside a $100 bill. The note was scrawled in hasty handwriting. It read, "I'm sorry, don't hitchhike anymore tonight." As I rounded a bend, I saw her. A young woman, thumb outstretched, a hopeful yet weary look on her face. Hitchhikers weren't common, but on a cold night like this, I couldn't just drive by. She hopped in with a grateful smile, introducing herself as Sandy. She was heading to a house just off Maple Street, not far from my own home. The drive was pleasant. Sandy talked about the beauty of the night sky and how she loved the peace of the countryside. It was refreshing to meet someone who appreciated the simple things in life. Before I knew it, we had arrived at a cozy-looking house nestled among the trees. She thanked me and left, her light laughter lingering in the air. Upon arriving home, I noticed a jacket on the passenger seat. It was Sandy's. I figured I'd drop it off at her place the next day, but something inside me urged me to return it that same night. I guess it was the thought of her being cold that made me turn my car around. When I knocked on the door of the house, an old woman answered. She had a kind face worn by time, but her eyes held a sadness that was hard to miss. "Hi, I'm looking for Sandy. She left her jacket in my car," I explained. The woman's face turned pale. "No one named Sandy lives here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Confused, I described Sandy, thinking there might have been some misunderstanding. But as I spoke, the woman's eyes widened with shock and she started to cry. "Sandy was my daughter," she sobbed. 12 years ago, she was killed in a drunk driving accident," she said softly as tears ran down her face. It felt like I had just been punched in the stomach. This had to be some kind of mistake. I described the night, how I picked Sandy up and dropped her off at this very house. But the woman, Mrs. Clarkson, insisted it was impossible. In her grief, Mrs. Clarkson invited me in. She showed me pictures of Sandy. It was the same girl, no doubt about it. The same bright eyes, the same warm smile. I was speechless. She shared stories of Sandy, how she was always kind and full of life, how she loved to hitchhike and meet new people. She even showed me Sandy's old room, untouched since her death. As we talked, a bizarre yet undeniable feeling washed over me. I had somehow connected with someone from another realm, someone who was no longer part of this world. It was unsettling, yet there was a strange sense of peace about it. Mrs. Clarkson, still holding the jacket, smiled through her tears. She always did love that jacket, said it brought her good luck. I stayed for a while listening to her reminisce. It was as if sharing these memories breathed life into her daughter's memory, if only for a moment. As I left, she thanked me, saying that our meeting had brought her some comfort. The drive home was a blur. My mind was racing with a million thoughts. Was it possible that I had given a ride to a spirit? Or was it just a coincidence? A girl who resembled Mrs. Clarkson's daughter? But how would that explain the jacket, the conversation, the familiarity of it all? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sandy's face, heard her laughter. I pondered over the mysteries of life and death, the thin veil between the past and the present, the living and the dead. The next day, I decided to do some research. I visited the local library and dug through old newspaper archives. And there it was, a report on a tragic accident that took place 12 years ago. The victim's name was Sandra Clarkson. In the weeks that followed, I visited Mrs. Clarkson regularly. We developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by the enigmatic encounter. She said it gave her a sense of closure, knowing that her daughter's spirit was still lively and free. Sometimes when I'm driving down that highway, I half expect to see her again, thumb outstretched, waiting for another ride. But all I see are the pine trees swaying in the wind, and I can't help but smile, thinking of Sandy and the unbelievable night when our paths crossed in the most extraordinary way. As someone who's spent a fair share of time thumbing rides across Canada, I've had my share of interesting encounters, but there's one that stands out, a ride in Ottawa, Ontario that turned into a story I often recount with a mix of disbelief and a wry sense of triumph. It's the story of how I got a free knife. It was a typical cold, overcast day in Ottawa, and I was hitchhiking to a friend's place across the city. I didn't have any particular urgency, just the casual plan of a lazy Saturday. Cars whizzed by, drivers offering apologetic shrugs or avoiding eye contact altogether. Just as I was contemplating a break, a car pulled up. It was a nondescript sedan, a bit worn at the edges. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" he asked. I told him, and he nodded, signaling me to hop in. Grateful for the ride, I settled into the passenger seat, eager to escape the biting wind. I've always been one to chat with my benefactors. It's part of the unwritten hitchhiker's code. So I started with the usual small talk, commenting on the weather, the city, and the traffic. But the driver was curt, offering only monosyllabic responses, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. An uneasy silence settled in the car. I decided to let it be, attributing his silence to a bad day or general disinterest. But the air was heavy with an unspoken tension, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Suddenly, without a word, the driver pulled out a pocket knife. The blade glinted ominously in the dull light of the car. He pointed at me, his voice cold and steady. "Wallet. Now." My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd heard of such situations, even joked about them. But facing the real deal was a whole different ballgame. I inched as far away as I could, pressing myself against the car door. The knife followed me, its point an unwavering threat. But then I noticed something: his eyes. They were still on the road, his focus not entirely on me or the knife. It was a split-second decision, a gamble driven by fear and a dash of foolish bravado. I reached for the knife, my hand moving faster than I thought possible. To my surprise, and likely his, I managed to wrench the knife out of his hand. The driver let out a string of expletives, his surprise turning to anger. But now, the tables had turned. I was no longer the defenseless hitchhiker. I was the one in control. "Pull over?" I demanded, my voice firmer than I felt. To my relief, he complied, bringing the car to a stop at the side of the road. My hand still gripped the knife, not out of a desire to use it, but as a symbol of my unexpected victory. I got out of the car, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I stood there for a moment, the knife in my hand, watching as the driver sped off. My heart was still pounding, a mix of fear, relief, and disbelief coursing through me. And that's how I got a free knife, I tell people when I recount this story. They usually laugh, thinking it's a punchline, a made-up ending to a hitchhiker's tall tale. But as I pull out the knife, a simple pocket knife with a worn handle. Their laughter fades, replaced by wide-eyed realization. The knife itself. It's become a sort of talisman for me, a reminder of the day I gambled on a split-second decision and won. It's not just a tool, it's a symbol of survival, of the fine line between trust and caution, and of the unexpected turns life can take. I've always considered myself a good judge of character. That's why, when I saw a man thumbing for a ride, something about him didn't sit right with me. But it was pouring rain, and he looked harmless enough, just a drenched traveler in need of help. Against my better judgment, I pull over. He dashed towards the car, a grateful smile on his face. "Thanks for stopping," he said, climbing in. "I'm headed to Carsonville." I noticed his clothes were more sophisticated than your average hitchhiker, a nice coat and clean shoes. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong on a muddy road in the middle of nowhere. The drive was mostly silent at first. I asked a few casual questions, but his answers were vague. He said his name was Mark and that he was visiting family in Carsonville. Something about his tone felt off. He was too calm, too collected for someone who'd just been caught in a downpour. As we continued, he became more talkative, but not in a friendly way. His questions turned personal. Where did I live? Was I married? Did I usually travel this road at night? His eyes, dark and probing, seemed to dissect my every response. A sense of unease crept over me. I gave non-committal answers, trying to appear unfazed, but internally, alarm bells were ringing. I decided to drop him off at the nearest gas station instead of taking him all the way to Carsonville. When I mentioned the change of plans, his demeanor shifted. The friendly facade melted away, revealing a cold, menacing stare. "No, you need to take me to Carsonville. You said you would," he insisted, his voice low and threatening. My heart pounded in my chest. I realized then that I was no longer in control of the situation. The once harmless hitchhiker now felt like a predator, and I was alone with him on a deserted road. I weighed my options. Driving to a populated area seemed like the best choice, but the nearest town was miles away. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the rain pounding against the windshield. As we approached a curve in the road, I saw the lights of a diner, its neon sign a beacon in the night. Seizing the opportunity, I pulled into the parking lot. "I need to use the restroom." "I'll be quick," I said, trying to sound casual. He protested, but I insisted, promising to be back in a minute. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I ran into the diner. My whole body was shaking. The waitress behind the counter gave me a concerned look as I blurted out that I needed help. She locked the front door and called the police while I watched through the window. The man got out of my car, looked around, and then started walking down the road, disappearing into the rainy night. The police arrived quickly. I gave them a full description, and they searched the area, but they didn't find him. They told me there had been reports of similar incidents on Route 27, of a man trying to isolate drivers for unknown reasons. I drove home that night with my doors locked and my mind racing. The encounter with the hitchhiker haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling of what might have happened if I hadn't stopped at that diner. I learned a valuable lesson that night. No matter how much you think you can read people, it's impossible to truly know a stranger's intentions. I've driven past hitchhikers since then, but I've never stopped again. The memory of that night, of the man who called himself Mark, serves as a chilling reminder of the danger that can come from a simple act of kindness.